Did housekeeping take a wrong turn? That's what billionaire Gregory Langford sneered when he saw a humble woman in a thrifted dress walk into the city's most prestigious gala. But what he didn't know was, she wasn't there to serve hors d'oeuvres. She was the headliner. And by the time she played her final note, his smirk would vanish, and the very concert hall he ruled would belong to her. This is the jaw-dropping, emotional story of Elena Fisher, a once-forgotten pianist who used raw talent, quiet defiance, and unmatched grace to silence a world that tried to keep her small. What begins as public humiliation becomes a global reckoning. What begins with a mocking insult ends with a symphony that brings royalty to tears. Prepare for a journey of transformation, poetic justice, and music that refuses to be ignored. This is not just a story, it's a standing ovation waiting to happen. Now, before we dive deeper, please like and subscribe to our channel. We share powerful, meaningful stories like this every day. And drop a comment below to let us know what time and where you're watching from. Thank you so much, and now let's get back to the story. Did housekeeping take a wrong turn? The man's voice sliced through the hush like glass against silk. Elena stopped mid-step on the crimson carpet, her hand still pressed to her chest, where the old locket rested beneath her cotton dress. Around her, murmurs flared like embers, soft, flickering, stinging. Flashbulbs dimmed. Conversations dropped. A ripple of uncomfortable laughter swept through the well-heeled crowd gathered beneath the glittering chandeliers of the Astoria Grand. She hadn't expected a welcome, but she also hadn't expected cruelty to wear such a charming smile. Gregory Langford, with his tailored Armani tux and silver-streaked hair, stood beside his date like a marble sculpture, chiseled, untouchable, and cruel in the way only the rich could afford to be. He didn't know her. Not really. But in his world, a woman in a thrift store dress with worn flats didn't belong in a place where the wine cost more than her monthly rent. Elena Fisher, a voice called from the entry podium, tinged with confusion, featured performer for tonight's gala. The name hung in the air like an unexpected note in a silent room. Elena lifted her eyes toward the stage, then slowly moved forward. One step, then another. Eyes followed her every move, not with admiration, but with thinly veiled disdain. Her back was straight, but inside, her stomach twisted. It was the same walk she had made 1,000 times before. Down subway halls with a cracked keyboard on her back, down rainy sidewalks after gigs that paid in food, not funds. But tonight, that walk felt heavier, more exposed. The carpet was too plush, the air too fragrant with expensive perfume and judgment. "Should have sent someone else," whispered one of the event organizers behind the curtain, not knowing she could hear. The hall inside was vast and golden, the kind that could swallow a person whole and not notice. Tables were dressed in white silk and crystal, and high above, golden cherubs stared down from the frescoed ceiling as if judging her too. Elena walked toward the baby grand in the center of the ballroom floor, past men in medals and women in diamonds, their gazes sharp as needles. She passed Gregory again. He raised a glass in mock salute. "Don't trip, sweetheart. That dress looks vintage, Civil War era perhaps?" More laughter. Quieter this time, but it still rang like thunder in her ears. She paused by the piano, closed her eyes, took a breath so deep it felt like her lungs might never let go of it. Then she sat. The bench was colder than expected, the keys slick and clean, a far cry from the sticky ones she used in the public plaza on 17th Street, where pigeons were her only audience. For a moment, she looked out at the crowd. None looked back. They were busy, adjusting their cuffs, sipping their drinks, preparing to be disappointed. Then she played. The first notes were gentle, hesitant even, like raindrops testing a rooftop. A Chopin nocturne, simple, familiar, elegant in the way only music could be when it said everything words could not. Her hands moved with grace learned from hardship, fingers that had bled on cracked keys, tendons that knew the ache of carrying groceries in one hand and compositions in the other. But no one noticed. A waiter clinked glasses on a tray. A woman whispered into her husband's ear and giggled. Gregory turned his attention to his phone, scrolling with a look of bored detachment. Elena pressed on. She wasn't here for them. Not really. She was here for her mother, who never saw her play in a gown but always believed she'd one day wear one. She was here for the music, which had saved her from silence more times than she could count. She was here because they didn't expect her to be. Halfway through, she shifted. The piece was no longer Chopin. She let her soul speak instead. The melody swelled, deeper, darker, her own composition. One she wrote in a laundromat while waiting for the spin cycle to end. One that lived in her bones. Pain laced with defiance, grief braided with hope. The crowd stirred, glasses stilled, eyes rose. Something they didn't expect was happening. Across the room, Gregory blinked. He looked up, his mouth parted slightly, as if the music had reached a corner of his heart he hadn't remembered existed. He tried to brush it off with a scoff, but his fingers curled tighter around his glass. From a table near the front, a journalist leaned forward, phone forgotten in her hand. The melody. It was familiar. Years ago, a viral video had swept the internet, just a clip grainy of a street performer outside a museum, playing a piece that had brought tears to millions. It had no name, no credit. But it had haunted her ever since. Now here it was. Here she was. And this time, they had a name. Elena's hands danced, no longer nervous, no longer small. She was inside the music now, letting it rise like a tide. The high notes sparkled like starlight, the lows rumbled like distant thunder. Every key she pressed seemed to challenge the room. See me, hear me, remember me. As the final note hovered, suspended in the stillness, the ballroom was utterly silent. Not a whisper, not a breath. Even the chandeliers seemed frozen in reverence. Then came the applause. It started slow, unsure. One person, then two. Then a storm of hands clapping, rising to their feet as though moved by something bigger than taste or charity or tradition. They were applauding not because they were told to, but because they had to. Gregory didn't stand. Not at first. He sat there, stunned, staring at the woman he'd ridiculed. His date nudged him. The camera crews were already filming. With practiced elegance, he rose, his applause just a fraction too late, too stiff, too hollow. Elena stood and bowed just once. No curtsy, no beaming smile. Just the quiet dignity of someone who no longer needed approval. As she stepped away from the piano, a small girl in a floral dress approached her, clutching a folded program. "Miss Elena," she whispered, "I want to play like you someday." Elena crouched, her eyes misting over. "You already do, sweetheart. You just haven't touched the keys yet." When she stood, Gregory was waiting, smiling, smooth, as if nothing had happened. "Impressive," he said. "Really, you play quite well for someone. Self-taught, I assume?" Her reply was soft, but it struck like a bell. "Yes, I taught myself, because schools like the one you fund refused me a scholarship." He blinked. The smile didn't fade, but the corners of his eyes twitched. "We'll have to fix that, won't we?" She walked past him, her steps slow and sure, as though she had walked through fire and come out polished, not burned. Outside, the night was velvet and quiet, the stars scattered like notes on a score. Elena looked up once, just once, and let herself smile, not at the performance, not at the applause, but at the knowing. She had always belonged here. They just didn't know it yet. "She's the one," the journalist whispered, her eyes wide with something between awe and disbelief. "That melody, it's hers." At first, only her table noticed. But words travel fast in rooms built on status. And tonight, truth was moving faster than any rumor ever had. Whispers flickered like candlelight down the line of velvet-draped tables, leaping from lip to lip, like a secret no one could bear to keep. "She's the street pianist." No, the street pianist. The one from the video? The one who made that child cry from a single note. Suddenly, every face in the room was turned toward Elena, but not with scorn. No longer did they see the plain dress, or the thrifted shoes, or the modest hairstyle. Now they looked at her like a ghost from the internet come to life. The anonymous soul behind the tune that had made millions ache without knowing why. Gregory watched the tide turn with a quiet unease masked behind a charming smirk. He didn't like losing control of a room, especially not to someone who didn't wear labels stitched in Paris. Still, he adjusted his cufflinks and stepped forward, deciding charm could mask condescension. Just as it always had. "Miss Fisher, is it?" he said smoothly, reaching out a hand as though offering diplomacy to a foreign queen. "Quite the talent you've kept hidden. It's rare, really, to see someone rise from, well, such humble origins." Elena turned, her eyes resting on him with the calm that often precedes a storm. "I never kept it hidden," she replied. "You just weren't looking in the right places." He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Perhaps. But now you have the attention you deserve. Congratulations." She nodded once without gratitude, then turned her gaze elsewhere. She had heard this tone before, from patrons who thought money forgave every insult, from gallery donors who mistook pity for admiration. She had learned long ago that applause could be polite without being sincere. Back at her table, a waiter offered her champagne. She declined, not out of humility, but because she preferred to stay sharp tonight. Something inside her told her this evening wasn't done unraveling. Across the room, the board members of the Astoria Grand had gathered at a side alcove. Murmurs between them weren't about music, they were about finance. A quiet decision was being revisited. For years, the venue had struggled. Too many costs, too little foot traffic. The historic grandeur was expensive to maintain, and the younger crowd preferred modern halls with digital acoustics. "She's worth a headline," one of them whispered. "Could spark a revival." Another shook their head. "Not enough. We'd still have to sell. One performance can't fix years of red." "But maybe one patron can." They looked at each other, unsure if what they were imagining was desperation or destiny. Back in the ballroom, Elena felt the shift. It was subtle, like the difference between fog and smoke. People were no longer curious, they were calculating. Faces that had dismissed her an hour ago now tilted with interest, with practiced charm, with potential agendas. She'd spent her life watching people read rooms. Now she was reading theirs. "Would you consider performing again?" someone asked, a tall man with 2 white teeth and a glimmering watch. "I'd pay double for a private concert," said another woman, trying to seem casual, but watching how others reacted first. And there, in the middle of it all, stood Gregory Langford, no longer laughing, but still smiling. A smile that said he believed he could spin anything. After all, men like him had always rewritten the final act. But Elena wasn't a story he was going to edit. A quiet beep came from the phone in her clutch. A message from her attorney. "All the paperwork is ready. Just say the word." She looked toward the far end of the room, where a low velvet rope separated the public from the board's private exit. She saw the executives lingering. Their faces were lined not with judgment, but with fatigue. She had seen that same look on her mother's face after 10-hour shifts in the hospital laundry unit. People who were barely keeping things together, hoping no one would notice how close they were to falling apart. She walked away from the stage. Gregory noticed and followed, his curiosity now sharpened by suspicion. "Where are you going?" he asked, with a lilt of amusement to mask the tremor in his ego. Elena stopped, turned. "To change the music," she said simply. Then she kept walking. She passed waiters and murmuring guests and the towering floral centerpieces that had tried to dwarf her earlier. But now with each step she seemed to rise, not physically but undeniably. There was a gravity to her now, a pull. Even those who didn't know her name could feel it. As she reached the board members, she greeted them with a smile that was soft but not small. They recognized her immediately, not just as the performer, but as someone who was no longer asking for permission to belong. "I understand the hall is for sale," she said gently, her voice as composed as her final chord. There was a long pause. Then, "It is. I'd like to purchase it." A longer pause. Then one of them, an older man with glasses and the kindest eyes in the room, asked, "Do you represent a buyer?" Elena took a deep breath. "I am the buyer." The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was reverent. The kind of silence reserved for something sacred being unwrapped for the first time. Back in the ballroom, Gregory was mid-toast, telling a group of donors how inspired he was by young talent, how he planned to offer Elena a mentorship under his foundation. "We must foster diamonds in the rough," he said. "If we don't elevate them, who will?" A voice cut across the room, firm, clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, may I have your attention?" It was the MC, now standing again beneath the golden archway. His expression had changed. He wasn't just announcing a performance, he was delivering history. "We are pleased, no, honored, to share that the Astoria Grand has found a new owner this evening. Effective immediately, the venue will be under the stewardship of Miss Elena Fisher." The room froze, forks dropped, eyes snapped toward Elena, who stood beside the board, serene and unshaken. And Gregory, oh Gregory, he did not move. His jaw clenched, his smile faltered, and for the first time that evening, he had no words. She stepped forward as the crowd parted. She didn't need to raise her voice. "This hall should be a place where brilliance isn't measured by gowns or bank accounts," she said softly. "It should be a sanctuary for art, for music, for children who play in train stations because no one gave them a chance. From this day forward, that's exactly what it will be." A roar of applause erupted, not just polite, not just presentable, real. She turned to leave, pausing just beside Gregory. She looked at him, not with bitterness, but with a quiet, final grace. "Thank you for your commentary earlier," she said. "It reminded me that true music doesn't need permission. It simply needs to be heard." She didn't wait for his reply. There was none that would matter. Outside, the night air met her like an old friend. A small wind lifted the hem of her dress, and for the first time all night, she felt warm. Her car wasn't a limo, but as she stepped into it, she felt something that no vehicle could provide. Power, peace, and the promise of every note still waiting to be played. The morning light painted the windows of Elena's small apartment in soft gold. Dust particles danced through the air like tiny notes drifting from a forgotten melody. The kettle hissed on the stove, filling the silence with the promise of something warm, something ordinary. But nothing about this morning would be ordinary. Elena stood barefoot in the kitchen, cradling a chipped mug between her hands, her eyes scanning the front page of the New York Herald. The headline stretched across the top like a brushstroke of disbelief. "Pianist stuns elite gala, then buys the concert hall here." Her photo was beneath it. Not one from the performance. No, the one someone had taken as she walked away from the piano, chin lifted, dress fluttering behind her like defiance stitched in cotton. There was something poetic about it. Something final. Her phone buzzed again. The sixth time that morning. She let it ring, sipping her tea, as the news anchor's voice carried faintly from the small television on the counter. And sources confirmed that Elena Fisher, once known only through a viral video as an anonymous street pianist, has not only stunned audiences with her performance last night at the Astoria Grand Gala, but also purchased the historic venue outright. No press conference has been held, but an official statement from her legal team says she plans to turn the hall into a community-centered music sanctuary. A knock sounded at the door. 3 soft raps. She knew before she opened it who it would be. Lucia, her neighbor from across the hall, stood there with a newspaper clutched to her chest and eyes shimmering with tears. "Elena," she whispered, voice thick with emotion, "I knew you were something else. But this." Elena opened the door wider. "Come in," she said gently. Lucia stepped in as if entering sacred ground. She looked around the familiar space, books stacked too deep on the shelves, sheet music piled like autumn leaves across the piano, and a small framed photo of Elena's mother next to a lit candle. "Your mother would be so proud," she said, touching the frame with reverence. Elena's throat tightened. "I hope so." Lucia stayed for a few minutes, talking in bursts between disbelief and admiration. Then she left, promising to fend off any reporters that might come sniffing around the building. But they came anyway. By noon, 3 cars idled outside the apartment building. By 2 o'clock, someone had found her old piano performance videos and uploaded a compilation titled "The Mystery Pianist Who Bought the Stage She Was Mocked On." It trended by sunset. Inboxes flooded, emails surged. Her assistant, a quiet, capable man named Mark who worked more often in the shadows than the spotlight, called just before dusk. "You've got 37 offers for interviews," he said, half laughing, half panicked. CNN, BBC, even Vanity Fair, and a message from Langford. Elena turned from the window. "What did he say?" "He wants a meeting, a formal apology," he says, "and a potential partnership opportunity." She let out a soft breath, 1 part amusement, 2 parts exhaustion. "Of course he does." Mark hesitated. "Should I reply?" Elena walked to the piano and sat. Her fingers brushed the keys but did not press down. "Not yet." Understood. After the call ended, she let her fingers fall into music again. A soft waltz, slow and nostalgic. Her mother's favorite. The same one she'd played the night her mother passed. Back then, it had been a lullaby for grief. Now it felt like a door opening. The next day she went back to the concert hall. The facade, once intimidating, now felt like a letter she'd written to herself years ago and forgotten to send. She stepped through the wide oak doors into the velvet hush of the empty lobby, where chandeliers hung like frozen constellations and dust clung stubbornly to carved balustrades. The manager greeted her with a mixture of formality and awe. "Miss Fisher," he said, offering a clipboard. "We're ready when you are. The transition team is assembled. They'll need your direction on the renovation priorities." She took the clipboard, eyes scanning line items like wall restoration, VIP box updates, and donor recognition hallway. "Remove that last one," she said softly. "Ma'am, I want no plaques for donors, no gold leaf names carved above doorways. Let the music speak. That's the only name that should echo in this place." He nodded, struck by the clarity of her vision. That afternoon, she walked alone through the performance hall, her footsteps echoing softly against centuries of layered applause. The stage still held the ghost of her last note. The curtain, half drawn, looked like it was waiting for a new chapter to be written. She closed her eyes, imagining it. Children from every corner of the city walking in with wonder in their eyes, their hands brushing the backs of seats they never thought they'd be allowed to sit in. Teenagers composing symphonies instead of fighting for silence in overcrowded apartments. A girl, just like she once was, playing a piano without having to earn her way to the keys by cleaning the floor beneath them. That night, Elena hosted a private meeting, not with donors or celebrities, but with local music teachers, community leaders, and school board members. They sat in folding chairs on the main stage, sipping lukewarm tea and listening as she unveiled her plan. Free music education, open recitals for local talent, weekly classes led by rotating volunteer professionals, a mentorship program for students who never thought they had a chance. There were no chandeliers in that meeting, no cameras, just honest faces and honest hope. At the end of the presentation, one teacher, an older man with weathered hands and a voice like gravel, stood and said, "We've waited a long time for someone like you, a very long time." She smiled. "Then let's not waste another minute." But as the applause died down and the guests began to leave, a shadow lingered at the edge of the hallway. Gregory Langford. She hadn't invited him. He had found his way in, as men like him often did. "Elena," he said, his voice unusually quiet. "I wanted to speak to you alone." She waited. He looked tired for the first time, not perfectly composed. His voice softened. "I was wrong. About you. About you. About everything. Up in rooms like this, where people like you were never more than background noise. I've spent my life writing checks, thinking that was enough. But what you did..." He stopped, searching for words that didn't sound rehearsed. "You didn't just prove me wrong, you reminded me I had forgotten what music could do." She let the silence stretch. "I'm not here to ask for redemption," he added quickly. "Just to say thank you for the wake-up call." She studied him. Not the suit, not the name, not the performance he wore in public, but the quiet behind his eyes. She nodded once. "You're welcome," she said. And just like that, he turned and left. No grand deal, no headline, just a man, humbled, and a woman whole. As the last light faded from the stained glass windows and the hall settled into its new breath, Elena walked onto the stage once more. She sat at the piano, fingers trembling, but not with fear. She played, not for the crowd, not for applause, but for every moment in her life when she had been told no, and every moment that had led her here. The first real snowfall of winter dusted the city in quiet silver. Streets gleamed with slush-streaked light, and the air held that stillness reserved only for moments when the world pauses to listen. The kind of silence a musician knows intimately, the breath before the note. Inside the now renamed Fisher Hall, the once hushed corridors rang with the chaos of transformation. Ladders leaned against newly painted walls. Workers buzzed through the lobby, replacing ornate but cold portraits with framed photographs of young children at pianos, smiles crooked, fingers uncertain, eyes shining with something Elena knew too well. Possibility. She stood near the entrance, arms crossed, coat wrapped tightly around her, watching it unfold like a dream she didn't dare speak aloud until now. The old carpet had been pulled up and replaced with rich, sustainable oak, warm to the eye and kind to the sound. Velvet ropes were gone, stanchions removed, every barrier between the audience and the music had been stripped away. Elena walked slowly down the main hall toward the stage, her boots soft against the new floor, the scent of sawdust lingering like perfume. The red curtain was no longer crimson velvet, it had been replaced with a translucent screen that shifted color with the stage lighting. a choice meant to symbolize transparency, evolution. She reached the edge of the stage just as the morning class was finishing up. A boy named Isaiah, 8 years old and always one breath away from mischief, stood beside the piano, eyes wide as his instructor clapped out a rhythm. He was all limbs and laughter, and yet when his fingers met the keys, they moved with a kind of grace that didn't match his age. He wasn't polished, not yet, but he played like he was asking the world a question and believing it would answer. Elena smiled. Her heart ached in the best way. In the corner sat Ms. Alvarez, the retired school teacher who had given Elena her first music book when she was 12. Now, decades later, she watched a new generation take root in the very hall that once locked its doors to people like them. As the class ended and children trickled into the lobby, Elena helped pack away a few sheets of music and turned when she felt someone watching her. A tall woman with sharp eyes and a tailored coat stood near the door. She was beautiful, severe, the kind of person who walked into rooms expecting silence to greet her. "You're Elena Fisher," she said. Not a question, but a statement already laced with judgment. "I am. I'm Celeste Harrow. I sit on the board of Heritage Arts Trust." Elena nodded once, careful but calm. "I've heard of your work. You fund several classical competitions, don't you?" "We do." Celeste stepped forward, heels echoing against the polished floor. "We also fund restoration for historic venues, many of which you've chosen not to seek grants from. May I ask why?" "I didn't want strings attached to music meant to be free," Elena replied simply. Celeste's smile was tight. "So noble. But these things have always required a certain structure. Standards, tradition. Without them, art loses its dignity." Elena looked around the room, at the children, at the joyful mess, at the walls alive with color and movement. "This hall has more dignity now than it ever did." "Is that what you think?" Celeste's voice dipped lower. "Because the whispers I'm hearing suggest otherwise. You've removed classical prerequisites from auditions. You're allowing anyone to play." "That's the point." Celeste's eyes narrowed, a crack in her pristine facade. "You'll find this city has long memories, Miss Fisher. Some of us protect tradition not out of arrogance, but responsibility." "I'm not trying to destroy tradition," Elena said gently. "I'm trying to expand who it belongs to." The conversation ended there, but its echo followed Elena for days. There were articles, opinion pieces, social media threads laced with admiration and disdain in equal measure. One headline read, "From prodigy to provocateur, is Elena Fisher diluting art or democratizing it?" Mark forwarded it to her with a one-line comment. "They're rattled. That means we're winning." But winning didn't always feel like victory. There were angry donors who pulled support, longtime patrons who canceled season passes, and one morning someone spray-painted the words "Real art takes years" across the concert hall doors. Elena arrived early that day. It was still dark and the paint was fresh. She didn't cry, she didn't rage. Instead, she picked up a cloth and began to wipe it clean herself, one slow, deliberate stroke at a time. By mid-morning, the hall was bright again. That same afternoon, a different kind of visitor arrived. A man in a navy jacket, carrying a worn violin case, waited near the reception desk. When Elena approached, he turned with eyes that were familiar, not because she knew him, but because she knew what lived behind them. Hunger, hope, fear of being seen too late. "I don't have paperwork," he said before she could even speak. "I don't even have a resume, but I have music." He opened the case. The violin was battered, but whole. He lifted it beneath his chin and began to play, softly at first, unsure of how the sound would be received. It wasn't perfect. His bow hand trembled. A few notes faltered. But what rose from the strings wasn't a performance. It was a prayer. When he finished, he lowered the instrument, eyes flickering with the need for approval. Elena smiled. "You're hired." He blinked. "What?" "You'll teach Thursdays and Saturdays, beginner strings, and you'll perform at our winter recital." His voice cracked. "No one's ever said that to me before." Then it's long overdue. Moments like that began to multiply. A woman in her 60s who had buried her piano dreams beneath decades of caretaking. A teenage refugee who carried her culture in song. A former inmate who learned to compose behind bars. They came. Not just for music, but for belonging. And Elena stood in the center of it all. Not as a queen of some newly claimed empire, but as a steward of something far older and more sacred. The belief that music was not the property of the elite, It was the birthright of the human soul. And yet, as the weeks turned into months, she felt something building again. Not resistance, not opposition, but a new kind of reckoning. There was one more piece left to play, something unfinished. She felt it in her bones, like a final note hovering in the air, waiting to land. The calendar on Elena's desk trembled slightly in the evening breeze. A single square was circled in blue ink. No label, no reminder, just a quiet mark. 3 days from now, the winter recital. Not the kind with ticketed seats and evening gowns, but one open to anyone. Families, friends, teachers, strangers. Free entry. Open hearts. It would be the first major event since Fisher Hall's rebirth. A crescendo to everything she had worked for since the night she'd played beneath golden lights and walked off stage into a new life. She stood alone beneath those same lights now, looking out over rows of newly upholstered seats. The auditorium had transformed, but it hadn't lost its soul. If anything, it felt more alive now, like the walls breathed again. The program was nearly set, dozens of students performing solos, duets, and original compositions. Some were polished, others were still raw, still learning, but every piece was a note in the larger story of what Fisher Hall had become, a sanctuary for the unheard. And at the end of the evening, Elena would perform one last piece, one no one had ever heard. One her mother had helped her sketch in fragments when Elena was only 13, back when their apartment was cold and the piano keys were plastic and gray. A lullaby without a name. She'd carried it like a scar and a secret for years, adding to it in bits, after heartbreaks, after losses, after moments of joy so fragile they didn't feel real until music held them. It was time to let it go, to give it a voice. And in doing so, to say goodbye to the silence that had haunted her for far too long. But outside Fisher Hall, silence was the last thing brewing. In a narrow marble-paneled office across the city, Celeste Harrow tapped her nails against a lacquered desk, her eyes scanning the rising tide of social media clips and local coverage praising the upcoming recital. The city was enamored. Even the critics were softening. She couldn't stand it. To Celeste, art was meant to elevate, not equalize. And while she'd mastered the performance of progressive generosity, Elena Fisher's success wasn't noble, it was dangerous. A challenge to the old structure. An affront to the legacy Celeste had spent her life preserving. And if Elena's concert became an uncontested triumph, the dam would break. She picked up her phone. "Make the call," she said coldly. The man on the other end didn't ask questions. Back at Fisher Hall, Elena walked the corridor where the music students had begun leaving personal notes and drawings. One read, "You made me believe I could matter." Another, "This place is where I finally found my sound." She knelt, taping a new message to the wall herself. "Keep playing, even when no one listens, especially then." It was just past midnight when Mark called. "You're not going to like this," he said, voice tense. Elena, curled in her reading chair with a manuscript across her lap, straightened. "What happened?" "The fire marshal just pulled your permit for the recital. They're claiming structural safety concerns." She stood. "That's not possible. We've passed every inspection." "They're citing anonymous complaints, saying the recent renovations could have weakened the foundation." "That makes no sense." "I know." A long silence hung between them. "They're trying to shut us down," Elena whispered. "Yes," Mark replied, "and we both know who's behind it." Celeste? Of course it was her. Elena could almost hear the woman's voice. Art without standards is noise. Accessibility is just another word for amateur. But something inside Elena shifted, not with anger, but clarity. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about every student whose hands had trembled over keys for the first time, every parent who had cried quietly in the back row, every dream that had stepped timidly into that hall and dared to ask, "Do I belong here?" She wouldn't let them be turned away. At dawn, she met with the city inspector herself, a weary man with tired eyes and a badge that barely stayed clipped to his jacket. She brought blueprints, contractor statements, engineer letters. They combed through every document, every line, every material used. 3 hours later, he looked up at her and said, "I don't see a single reason this place should be closed." "Then why?" He held up a hand. "Because someone important asked." She studied him. "And if I file an appeal?" He sighed. "That someone might make your life very difficult, but you'd be within your rights." She did it anyway. By noon, the appeal was filed. By 3 o'clock it was granted, conditional approval pending final walkthrough. The recital would proceed. But whispers still leaked into the press. That Elena was rushing, that the new community-first structure was reckless, that children were being used for spectacle. Gregory Langford called her that evening. "I've been watching," he said, voice surprisingly subdued. "You're doing something real, but they won't stop unless someone with louder money speaks for you." "I don't want money to speak for me," she said softly. "No, but sometimes it's the only language power understands. Let me help." She hesitated. "Why?" "Because I once looked at you and saw nothing," he said. "And I've never been more ashamed of myself. Let me fix what I can." And though every instinct in her told her to reject his offer, another part of her, the one that believed in change however slow, said maybe, just maybe, redemption could come in unlikely forms. "Only if the help stays quiet," she finally said. "This isn't about you," he agreed. The night before the recital, the hall was silent again. The snow had thickened outside. Inside, the piano sat uncovered, polished to a soft glow. Elena sat down, fingers trembling slightly. She opened the worn manuscript, dog-eared, frayed, filled with her mother's penciled notes. The melody was delicate, fragile as a memory. She played it once, then again. By the third time, tears slid down her cheeks, not from sadness but from release. This was the note that had lived in her since childhood. This was the promise she made to herself long ago, sitting on milk crates with her mother beside her, whispering, "One day, they'll hear you." Tomorrow, they would. And nothing, not sabotage, not scorn, not silence, could stop it now. Snowflakes melted on the shoulders of winter coats as a line curled down the block outside Fisher Hall. Breath curled in the frigid air, boots crunched on salted sidewalks, and eyes lifted toward the light, spilling from the tall arched windows above. Inside, warmth radiated, not from temperature, but from the hum of something sacred about to happen. Children in pressed shirts and wrinkled dresses rushed down the aisles, clutching sheet music with trembling hands. Parents found seats near the front, their phones clutched like lifelines. Volunteers buzzed through the wings, adjusting stands and smoothing programs that had been printed by a local print shop just the night before. No gold-embossed titles, just names, first and last, everyone equal. Elena stood backstage in the half-dark, watching through the curtain slit as the auditorium filled beyond capacity. There were people standing against the walls. Some sat cross-legged in the aisles. Even the balcony, unopened for years, now held families wrapped in scarves and soft hope. A hush fell as the lights dimmed. Then Isaiah, the 8-year-old with the wild grin, stepped onto the stage and bowed deeply. His hands shook as he sat at the upright piano and placed his fingers on the keys. For a moment, he froze. Elena whispered from behind the curtain, "Just breathe, sweetheart. Play it like you're telling a secret." He did. The first note was barely audible, but it floated out like a message in a bottle, then another, then more. The rhythm stumbled at first, but then smoothed, like a child learning to walk and suddenly running. When he finished, the audience erupted. Not in polite clapping, but a full standing ovation for a boy who dared to try. The performances followed, one after another. A teenage girl from the South Bronx sang a lullaby in her native Swahili. A trio of brothers, each taught by the same volunteer, played a four-handed arrangement, elbowing each other mid-note and laughing when the audience did too. Some were pitchy. Some forgot lines. One child sneezed in the middle of a flute solo and just kept going. But not one of them was mocked. Not one was dismissed. The music was alive, imperfect, real. Elena watched each one as if their triumphs stitched new threads into her own soul. And then, near the end, she heard it. A faint distortion in the speaker system. She stepped forward as the lights shifted to prepare for her final performance. A technician in black approached from the wings. "Something's wrong with the main amp," he whispered. "We checked everything this afternoon, but just now, it's humming. Could be sabotage." Her eyes narrowed. "Can you fix it?" "I'll try. Might have to reroute audio manually through the house speakers," she nodded. "Do it, even if it's raw." The crowd was quiet now, waiting. Elena stepped onto the stage. She wore no gown, just a black turtleneck, soft slacks, and the locket her mother had given her the week before she passed. Her hair was pulled back, no makeup, nothing to hide behind. The piano, restored and waiting, sat beneath a single golden spotlight. She took her place. For a moment, she said nothing. Then she leaned toward the microphone. "Tonight," she said, "you've heard brilliance that couldn't be measured in technique. You've witnessed courage that doesn't wear medals. And you've proven that music, real music, belongs to everyone who has something to say, even if their voice shakes." A pause, breath caught. "My final piece tonight is a promise. I made it to someone who never saw me perform in a concert hall, but she saw me play in the dark, on plastic keys, when I didn't believe in much of anything except the power of a song." She closed her eyes, and then she played. Soft at first, notes that wove like whispers between lost friends, then stronger. The melody swelled, delicate and broken, then rising into something new. Something painful and beautiful, like learning to love again after heartbreak. Each note carried weight. Memory, regret, gratitude. The left hand moved like gravity, grounding sorrow. The right hand soared like forgiveness given too late, but still given. Tears slid silently down cheeks across the room. A father pulled his daughter closer. An old man in the third row closed his eyes and swayed as if remembering a song he hadn't heard since he was young and reckless and in love. And then the lights flickered. The sound system buzzed sharply. For one terrible second, the entire room went dark. Gasps. A child whimpered. Then the light returned. Only the piano was silent. Elena's hands hovered above the keys, frozen. She stood, walked to the front of the stage. "No system," she said softly, voice trembling but defiant. "No microphone, no lights. That won't stop a song." She turned back to the piano. Without amplification, without spotlight, she sat and played again. This time, raw, vulnerable, bare. The audience leaned forward, the ones in the back rows straining to catch the music. But it was there, even in the hush, even in the fragility, like the sound of hope returning to a room long abandoned. By the time she reached the final chords, you could hear sobs, stifled, then unashamed. And when she lifted her hands, the room didn't clap at first. It stood, quietly, together. Then, applause, thunderous, shaking the walls, a wave of gratitude not just for the music, but for the truth of it, for the defiance of silence. And somewhere backstage, a security guard found the severed wire behind the speaker system. Deliberate, sabotage. They never found out who gave the order. But Elena didn't press charges. She didn't need revenge. The music had already answered. Later that night, after the last chairs were folded and children carried sleeping siblings home, Elena stood alone on the stage again. She looked up at the ceiling, the same ceiling that had once housed judgment and elitism and cold applause. Now it echoed only warmth. Mark joined her, silent beside her for a long time. She finally turned to him. "They'll try again." "Let them," he said. "You already won." She smiled, tears drying on her skin. "Yes," she whispered, "but this time we all did." The morning after the recital arrived like a quiet tide, washing gently over the city with a hush that felt reverent somehow. Snow still lay thick on the rooftops, but the sky was clear now, a pale silver brushed with morning blush. Elena sat by her window, wrapped in an old knitted shawl that still held the scent of lavender from her mother's drawer. A mug of untouched tea rested in her lap, long since gone cold, but she didn't notice. Her eyes were fixed on the small television tucked into the corner shelf, where the screen now showed a familiar image, her own face. Footage from the recital flooded every local channel. Grainy phone videos taken during her final performance showed her hands moving across the piano in candlelit shadow, the audience rising to their feet in silence, a raw kind of reverence sweeping the room. News anchors called it an unscripted miracle, a revolution in real time. One segment played her speech about her mother in full, uncut. And then suddenly, something else. "We've just received word," the anchor continued, "that an anonymous donor has nominated Elena Fisher for the Kennedy Medal of Cultural Advancement, a distinction awarded to artists who transform not only their medium, but the lives of those who experience it." The words didn't sink in. Not at first. She just blinked, lips parted, like the sound had entered her ears but couldn't quite reach her. Mark called within minutes. "You saw?" he asked, though his voice was already breathless with excitement. "I saw," she whispered. "There's more. Interviews, international coverage. You've been invited to speak at the World Music Summit in Geneva. The mayor's office wants to host a public concert in Central Park. Your students, you, the community, all of it." Elena leaned back, heart hammering against her ribs, like it was trying to make sense of the sudden tilt of the world. A part of her wanted to cry, another part wanted to laugh, and the deepest part, the quiet core of her that still remembered the sting of being told she wasn't welcome in conservatories or competitions, wanted to whisper, "It's happening." But then came the letter. Delivered by courier. Heavy envelope. Embossed seal. A formal invitation from the Conservatoire Royal de Paris. Not just to perform, but to join the faculty as their youngest ever visiting master. She sat with it for hours. The words didn't just sparkle with prestige, they echoed. This was the very institution that had once denied her application without an audition. She'd mailed them recordings, scores, letters of recommendation, none of which ever received a reply. Now they wanted her not as a student, but as a voice, a teacher, a name on their wall. When Mark came by that evening, he found her staring at the letter again. "You're going, right?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. Finally, she set the letter down. "I'm honored," she said softly. "Truly, but I didn't build this to walk away from it." "You wouldn't be walking away," Mark replied. "You'd be expanding. A 6-month term in Paris. Imagine the bridge it builds. Imagine who you bring with you." She looked at him, the firelight flickering across her face, shadowing her expression in a storm of thought. "And imagine who I leave behind," she said. That night, she walked to Fisher Hall alone. The building slept, but she had a key. She stepped inside and wandered through the echoing stillness, fingers brushing along walls still decorated with students' artwork, little handprints painted beside musical notes. She entered the main hall and sat in the third row center. The piano gleamed in the soft security light. Empty chairs stood in quiet rows, as if waiting to breathe again. Elena closed her eyes, and she imagined a lecture hall in Paris. She, in a blazer and scarf, speaking to bright-eyed prodigies fluent in Mozart and Debussy, teaching them to hear music not just with their ears, but their scars. She imagined bringing Isaiah with her one day, maybe even Ada, the shy girl who only played after everyone left the room. But she also imagined the cracks growing back into the walls of Fisher Hall, subtle but steady if left untended. She imagined someone else taking her place, someone who didn't know how to tell a child, "You don't need to be perfect to be heard." In that moment, a question bloomed inside her, quiet and honest. Is this about legacy or presence? She sat there for what felt like hours, and then softly she stood. The next morning her reply was sent. To the Conservatoire, gratefully declined. To the World Summit in Geneva, accepted. To the mayor's office, eager to collaborate. And to her students, pinned to the community board in Fisher Hall. "I've been asked to teach in places I once dreamed of. But I've come to learn the most important lessons happen where your heart beats loudest. My heart is here. Let's keep building something beautiful together. Miss Elena." By noon, the letter had gone viral. Not because it rejected fame, but because it chose faith. And as the days passed, Fisher Hall didn't fade from memory. It became legend. A place where auditions required no pedigree. A place where pianos were played barefoot. A place where music wasn't a performance, but a promise. And Elena, once mocked on a red carpet for her dress, now received letters from presidents, poems from prison inmates, and scholarships in her name gifted to young girls in foster care. But she never wore a gown. She never played for royalty. And she never stopped sitting in the third row on Friday nights, watching new students step onto the stage for the very first time, smiling, knowing that a single note, played bravely, could echo forever. The late March rain tapped gently against the stained glass of Fisher Hall, casting watercolor shadows across the lobby floor. It was a soft day, gray, quiet, the kind that asked you to think more deeply than you wanted to. Elena stood by the entrance, watching as the children left their after-school lessons, laughter trailing behind them like footprints in the mist. Spring had almost arrived, though the wind still carried a bite. Tulips dared to bloom too early in the flower beds just beyond the courtyard, as if trusting that warmth would keep its promise this time. She turned toward the front desk when the bell above the door rang. Her smile faded. Time didn't stop, but it slowed. The man who stepped inside looked older than she remembered, but not by much. His face was more weathered, yes, but the slope of his shoulders and the familiar crease above his brow brought her back to a place she had long since buried. A place of sharp words and longer silences. Dad? He removed his hat, held it in his hands like he didn't know what else to do with them. His eyes, the same soft brown as her own, flickered over the building. "This is yours?" he asked, voice gravel-coated, softer than she remembered. She nodded once, unsure if her voice would hold. "Yes." "It's beautiful," he murmured, "like your mother would have dreamed." She said nothing. Not yet. He took a slow step forward, then another, and each one sounded heavier than the last. "I saw you on the news," he said. "Someone showed me the recital. I didn't recognize the girl at the piano. Not at first. Then I heard the song. Your mother's lullaby." The silence between them pulsed. Elena folded her arms. "You left before she ever heard it." "I know." His voice cracked. Just a hairline fracture, but it was there. "I told myself I didn't belong at her funeral, that I wouldn't be welcome, that you'd be better off remembering me gone." "You didn't even write," she whispered. "I didn't know how." "That's not true." He stepped back slightly at her tone, as if expecting a storm and unsure whether to run or wait for the rain to fall. "I was a coward," he said. "I let grief turn into guilt and guilt into silence. I didn't think I had the right to see you again. But then," he looked around again, eyes glassing over. "This place, what you've done. I didn't know you had it in you, but your mother did." Her breath caught. She blinked hard once. She believed you'd become something that couldn't be ignored, that the world would have no choice but to listen. I didn't believe her. A pause. "I do now." Elena turned, her hands trembling just enough to betray her composure. She walked a few steps down the hall, then stopped. "You taught me to be silent," she said, "to play quietly, to not disturb, even when I had something to say." "I know," he said behind her. "I was wrong." She turned back to him. "You were afraid of my mother's music. You said it stirred things better left asleep." His eyes dropped. "She played like she was fighting for something," he whispered. "And I couldn't understand what. It made me feel small." "You made her feel smaller." "I was broken, Elena. We all were." She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She just stood there, in the quiet of the hall she had built, brick by invisible brick, with every measure she had ever written, every student she had ever believed in, every life she had chosen to lift because no one had lifted hers. And still, despite everything, she stepped forward. I built this to be a place where forgiveness had space to sit down," she said. He looked up. And today's not the day I give it to you," she said gently. "But I built the chair." A long pause. He nodded slowly, the breath leaving him like a man who'd waited too long to exhale. "Can I stay a while?" he asked. "Just to hear someone play." She hesitated, then nodded. He sat in the back row, not the third, not the front where parents usually beamed, but in the back where ghosts often sat. A girl walked onto the stage soon after, 7 years old, too small for the bench. Elena adjusted the seat for her and smiled. "Tell your story, Ada," she whispered. Nice and slow. The child nodded and began to play. It was a song she'd written herself, choppy, brave, a little too fast in the middle. But when it ended, the man in the back wiped his cheek with the edge of his sleeve. When the lesson ended and the students filtered out again into the light rain, Elena walked up the aisle toward him. He stood. They didn't speak. She just held out a folded sheet of music. He took it. "What's this?" he asked. She looked down. "The piece I played that night." He unfolded it slowly. Notes danced across the page like a memory written in ink. It wasn't perfect. There were still crossouts, scribbled margins, handwritten breath marks. "It's not finished," she said. He looked up. "Maybe we finish it together." The hope in his face didn't rise, didn't break open in joy. It trembled like a flame trying not to go out in the wind. "I'd like that," he said, and for the first time since she was a little girl, pressing her ear to the bedroom wall to hear her mother play late into the night, Elena let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, music really could bring people home. The mornings grew warmer, and with spring came soft green on the trees and sunlight that lingered longer in the late hours. Elena stood by the open doors of Fisher Hall, a mug of coffee in her hand, watching students chase each other across the courtyard before class began. Laughter echoed between the stone walls, carrying with it a music all its own. Inside, her father had begun coming by once a week. At first, he sat quietly in the back during lessons, never speaking unless spoken to, always careful not to impose. Elena didn't give him keys. She didn't offer him her time outside of those visits. But she let him return, like a song you don't quite remember how to play but can't bear to abandon. One day she found him seated at the piano in the small side studio, fingers hovering over the keys without touching them. "I don't know what to play," he said when she walked in. She stood beside him, folding her arms. "Then don't play," she replied. "Listen, the silence will tell you." He smiled faintly. "You sound like her." "She taught me well." They didn't talk about the past much, not directly, but it lived between them like a low hum, and sometimes it harmonized. One afternoon, Elena handed him a half-finished score. "Can you try adding a second voice?" she asked, "where it dips here." He stared at the page a long time, then nodded. "I'll try." It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a beginning. Meanwhile, Fisher Hall flourished. The city had adopted its model as a pilot program for other neighborhoods, launching 3 smaller halls in underserved districts, all built around Elena's philosophy. Talent without access is still talent. Dignity belongs in every octave. Musicians from all over began offering their time. Alumni of Juilliard, cellists from Spain, a blind harpist from Iceland who taught children how to feel chords through vibration. Fisher Hall became less of a building and more of a movement. And then came the letter, delivered again by courier. This time sealed in deep green wax with gold lettering across the top. The Crown Philharmonic Trust. Elena sat alone when she opened it, the light of the afternoon sun slanting across her desk in long stripes. She read it twice before letting it settle in her lap. It was an invitation, not to speak, not to teach, to compose. A symphony. Commissioned by the Trust, premiered by the Royal Orchestra in London, performed at the Queen's Hall, broadcast to 6 continents. Conducted by Sophia Baron. Yes, the same Sophia who once refused to share a stage with a street pianist. Elena leaned back in her chair, closed her eyes, and let the weight of it bloom and settle. It was everything she'd ever wanted, and nothing like what she imagined it would feel like. She took the letter home that night, laying it on the kitchen table beside a bowl of clementines and a manuscript of one of Ada's songs. Her apartment smelled like jasmine and ink. Outside, the wind tapped against the windows like an old friend trying to speak. The next morning, she didn't respond to the offer. She taught her classes, held a workshop, watched Isaiah perform his first solo with both feet finally able to touch the ground. That night, she invited her father to walk with her. They strolled slowly along the river near Fisher Hall, the water shimmering under the city lights. He hadn't asked about the letter, but she knew he'd heard. "They want me to write something new," she said after a while. "Something enormous." "You could," he said simply, "but I don't know if I should." "Why not?" "Because it would take me away. For a long time, I'd have to be elsewhere. I'd have to leave what I've started." He nodded, listening the way he rarely did when she was a child. Not with the intent to reply, but to understand. "Elle," he said after a long pause, using the nickname he hadn't spoken in 20 years. "You built this place out of nothing but will and a handful of broken notes. That kind of magic doesn't vanish just because you take a breath somewhere else. You've earned a new horizon." She looked down at her hands, the calluses faint now but still present. "I'm afraid if I leave, I'll lose the very thing that made all this possible." He stopped walking, turned to her. "Then don't leave," he said. "But don't stay because you're afraid either. Stay because the music still lives here. Or go because it calls you there. Just don't let guilt be the melody." That night, Elena sat at her piano for hours, sketching ideas she didn't plan to finish. She played the unfinished lullaby again. She cried. Not from sadness, from knowing she was standing at a new threshold, and this time, no one was pushing her through it. Mark arrived the next morning, holding a newspaper with her name on the front. The Philharmonic had released a statement. "We await a voice that can transform silence into something holy." She smiled, then picked up her phone and said yes, but with a condition. "I want to bring 5 of my students," she told them. "They'll write a companion piece. They'll perform it first, and they'll share that stage." There was a pause on the line. Then, "Consider it done." When the news broke, Fisher Hall did not mourn. It celebrated. Children created a mural of Elena on the south wall, her hands painted gold, her eyes looking upward. A plaque below it read, "She played so the world could listen, and listened so the world could play." Her father helped organize the final spring concert before she left. He opened the show with a short, aching solo. It wasn't flawless, but no one cared. The final performance was Elena and Ada, four hands on one bench, playing a duet they had written together. The last note hung in the air, long and trembling, like the end of a promise fulfilled. Elena stood, faced the audience, and for once said nothing. She didn't need to. Her music had already spoken for her. The Queen's Hall in London rose before her like a cathedral of sound, all arches and carved balconies, its ceiling a dome of gold leaf and light. Elena stood at the edge of the stage hours before the crowd would arrive, her fingers grazing the conductor's stand, the silence pressing around her like velvet. Behind her, rows of polished seats awaited royalty, press, composers and critics from 6 continents. Every performance here lived in memory for decades, carved into history with the same weight as coronations or peace accords. And now it was her turn. She exhaled slowly, still uncertain if she belonged in a place that once felt so distant, it may as well have floated among the stars. Footsteps echoed behind her. She turned. Sophia Baron stood just inside the wings, tall, cold, impeccably dressed, a statue carved from discipline and precision. The same woman who once sneered at Elena's street clothes and refused to share the stage with a pianist who didn't understand restraint. Tonight, she would conduct Elena's symphony. They hadn't spoken in person until now. "Miss Fisher," Sophia said, inclining her head, "I've studied your score." Elena held her gaze. "And? I've never read a piece that broke so many rules and still held together like a cathedral made of ash and fire." A long pause. "I underestimated you," Sophia added. "That's not a mistake I make twice." Elena offered a quiet nod. "I'm not here for an apology," she said. "Just the truth." "You have it," Sophia replied. "And tonight the world will have it too." By evening, the Queen's Hall shimmered with anticipation. Elena's students, seated near the front in tailored suits and handmade dresses, whispered nervously backstage. They would open the night. Their composition, 5 Doors, was a patchwork of melodies from different lives. A refugee ballad, a jazz motif, a lullaby, a protest chant, and a single repeating piano note that echoed like a heartbeat through it all. When the lights dimmed, they walked onto the stage as one. The audience, expecting perfection, received something far better: truth. Tears welled, hands clutched hearts. The applause when they bowed shook the rafters. Then came the moment. Elena stepped out, alone, in black. No jewelry, no fanfare, just a small silver pendant around her neck, her mother's locket. She bowed once, sat. Sophia raised her baton, and the symphony began. The first movement opened in dissonance, strings rising like arguments between generations, brass muttering beneath like resentment long buried. The piano entered late, hesitant, fragile, her own voice arriving after the world had already begun talking. But then, the second movement. A single cello, playing the lullaby. The one her mother hummed between laundry cycles, the one that saw her through hunger, rejection, loneliness. The orchestra picked it up, transformed it, built it until it stretched across the stage like dawn finally breaking. In the third movement, percussion exploded, marching, urgent, tense. It sounded like the night she was laughed off the red carpet, like the moment she chose to buy the hall, like defiance turned into music. Then finally, the fourth. Everything fell quiet, just the piano. Her. She played slowly, whispering through the keys. You could hear a pin drop in the hall. No one moved. And when she finished, when the final note rang out, held by trembling strings that faded into nothing, there was a silence so complete it felt sacred. Then came the ovation. Not just standing, roaring, people wept openly. Reviewers forgot to take notes. Even Sophia Baron turned to her, eyes wet and mouthed, "Thank you." Later, in the hallway behind the stage as the crowd still echoed beyond the doors, Elena stood alone with her hands still tingling from the final note. Her students found her. They didn't speak. They just hugged her all at once, a clumsy tangle of arms and laughter and tears. And when they stepped back, Elena looked at them, really looked. She saw herself in every single one of them, not just in their talent, in their becoming. Then she looked beyond them, toward the far wall of the hall, where an old photograph had once hung. Beethoven, lips curled, eyes defiant. Now beside it, a new frame waited. A plaque beneath read, "Elena Fisher, composer, founder, daughter of music." She touched the frame gently. But it wasn't her own face she was thinking of. It was her mother's hands. her students' laughter, her father's eyes as they filled with pride he'd never learned to speak aloud, and the child she used to be, sitting at a plastic keyboard in a one-bedroom apartment, believing no one would ever listen. Now, the world had heard her, and it would never forget her song. To anyone who's ever been mocked for the way they look, where they come from, or how quietly they begin, this story is for you. Elena Fisher didn't rise to greatness because she fit into the world's mold. She rose because she shattered it. She was underestimated, dismissed, silenced, and she used every rejection as a note in the greatest symphony of her life. She proved that your worth isn't measured by applause, wealth, or who opens the door for you, but by what you build when the door slams shut. From being humiliated on a red carpet to owning the very hall that once tried to exclude her, Elena reminds us all, dignity can't be bought, and true power comes not from dominance, but from purpose. Music was her weapon, grace was her response, and legacy, well, that was her answer. So if you're carrying wounds, doubts, or dreams too big for your space, remember, the world may not listen right away. But when your moment comes, play so loudly that even silence stands to applaud. Because the stage isn't just for the chosen, it's for the brave.